Welcome, everyone. This is Sheila Crye, past president from lesdamesdc.org, interviewing Karima Moyer-Nocchi. Uh, sorry. um, and our topic today is oral histories. Karima has done some fabulous oral histories for her book, Chewing the Fat, where she interviewed elderly Italian women who were girls during the Mussolini years and used those oral histories as the template for an analysis of the social structure. So since we're going to be doing some interviews and oral histories of our members, we'd like to ask Karima some questions about methods. So, Karima, is there anything you'd like to give us as an introduction?
Yes, my name is Karima Moyer-Nocchi.
Thank you.
At the University of Siena in Italy. I've lived in Italy for 30 years, and that's pretty much where my culinary experience is. However, I have more recently expanded into other parts of Europe and am right now, as I speak, at the Smithsonian, where I'm carrying out a fellowship for a culinary history project that I've been working on for a few years, which culminates in the United States. So my first book is, as Sheila said, based on oral histories. And so that's the background that I have, which from which the perspective from which I'm bringing you this information. So would you like to start with a question or?
Sure. Okay, so when you do an oral history, how do you preserve it?
So I was working with women who were in their 90s, and I think an important thing is that whatever method you're using to record an oral history, that it be as little invasive as possible. If you can avoid clipping microphones on people and even having them necessarily aware of what you're using. So in my case, with 90-year-old women, I was using an iPad. It was an object that they didn't even recognize, and were completely unaware, except for the fact that they had signed a release form, which is also important from a practical point of view, getting that permission. So they knew that it was going to be recorded. They knew for what purpose, that it wasn't going to be used outside of that. Requests that I had had from other people who maybe wanted to access the information, the actual interviews for their dissertation or something. I didn't have that permission. I hadn't received that permission, and the recordings remained with me. So non-invasive is very important. There is something in oral history that is debatable about what's called contamination in who's going to be present when you take an oral history. Contamination means that it is just you and the other person. This is something that I personally came up against and feel very strongly that needs to be reconsidered case by case, as do a lot of things. Because the women that I was interviewing about the topic that we were talking about, they were much more open and not willing to talk about it because I was there and they didn't necessarily know me, but because they were telling their story, and their story needed to reach, most importantly for them, that their story reached their family. And so when their family members gathered around, I noticed that that was the time that they really opened up. And I was facilitating not only my work, but also creating this bridge between, I interviewed women, so between the woman and the audience that she was, or her family members, who, because I was speaking about fascism, it was not a topic that anyone wanted to revisit necessarily. So I just wanted to say that about contamination, the equipment that is used for it. It's very important making a distinction as well between what oral history is and what an interview is, or memoir gathering, or a simple, which is not necessarily to simplify it, but open-ended biography, where someone's simply talking about their life and giving their life story. An oral history project needs to have a premise. The premise needs to be, and this is really important, it needs to be flexible, because you start off with your research. You start off with a series of questions necessarily that needs to be open enough so that you're not forcing an issue. You want to discover something, and these are the questions that you feel are going to be pertinent to that discovery. However, they also can't be leading questions where you're taking someone necessarily into an avenue that they're going to perceive what they're supposed to say rather than what they would naturally say. And that's a really difficult thing to do. With your premise, you also need to be prepared to discover that your premise is wrong. As I am speaking from experience, I had done all of my research. I was in Italian. I speak the language. I had expectations that really didn't pan out. And I discovered very quickly that the language that I needed to speak to these people wasn't necessarily I speak Italian and you speak Italian, but the jargon that they use, which is going to make a distinction between how much they're going to open up to you, because the vocabulary that you use determines how comfortable they feel with the amount of information that they're going to reveal. When they see that you are not surprised or shocked or by what they're saying, but interested, that's going to create a feeling of comfort that makes them want to continue. So have your premise and your questions flexible, open-ended, and review them. I found it very useful I listened to the interviews directly afterwards, and because I wanted to arrive at a transcription that I was then going to translate into English, I wanted to have the tone and feeling of the interview there. So if you're not dealing with necessarily doing another translating into another language, that's a different issue. Okay. So because then you come into tone and maintaining the tone in English of that other language. So flexibility of your premise, flexibility of your questions, be prepared to change that around, even as if you are one person, because then it's different. If you're one person who is doing a project with a lot of people, or if there are a lot of you who are all doing a one-on-one, those are other considerations to take into account. If you're doing a project that involves a lot of people and a lot of interviewers, then I would recommend that the interviewers meet relatively frequently to discuss how they're progressing, if you have an ultimate goal of what the project is going to be useful for and used for. So getting into, I mean, if I were to get into then the relationship, there are always people who are going to be more talkers than others. I had interviews where I could sit down, ask a couple of questions, and then for 2 hours, someone could just go on and on. And others, I had to move through every bit because they were shy, or you know, feelings like in my sample, for example, there were a lot of women who only had 4 years of education, and they felt a little intimidated by the situation. So again, it's all depends on what your topic is. Again, there does need to be a premise that you're aiming for, rather than just tell me about your life. So the amount of intervention that you do depends on each person, but you always need to be careful that you're not leading the person down the path, which is so tempting to do, down a certain path. If, as in my case, there is a very sensitive political situation that you're dealing with, so as far as fascism goes, it's relatively understood. We're talking from a hindsight point of view. We're looking at it with hindsight in a world that has decided that fascism isn't a good thing. Whereas the life that they were living, and I was very fortunate in speaking about my particular case, I was very fortunate that that didn't become an issue of feeling like they needed to act like they hadn't thought at the time that fascism wasn't a good thing. There were only a couple of them who had anything to do with the partigiani, who were anti-fascists. They all knew very well that they were in a certain kind of soup, and that they were all in that, and that it was about being enthusiastic for that party. So the difference between context now and context then, and what people are expected to feel. Also, we all come to something with our own baggage. that's undeniable, and so you just need to be careful. So thinking about the purpose of oral history and why you're doing oral history. Is it a what's called restorative history, in that you're seeking to address a past injustice and heal a historical trauma, which was in part what I was trying to do, specifically because the people that I was speaking to were not celebrities, famous writers, or anything like that. And that is the voice that I wanted to capture. So you are providing a voice to the unsung. Also, in the medium that you're working, I was writing and preparing a book. I chose in there is also a degree to which you're using the information for an analysis to feed an analysis. And how are you going to structure that? In mine, I decided to give, I would say, 85–90% over to the woman's voice, with interpolation, so that my reader would have clarification on what the women were talking about that they might not necessarily know culturally. So just laying out an oral history, in my case, without that interjecting every now and then for clarification, or because I was constructing a culinary history, I also needed to clarify certain culinary cultural things that were going on that the woman would have taken for granted, not knowing that she was speaking to an Anglophone readership. So, so what kind of voice are you bringing out, and why is it important to bring that voice out? I was bringing out an unsung voice. You're providing, in an oral history, you are providing the perspective of individuals who give a personal dimension to history. So again, using my thing about fascism, multiple books on fascism. This is a personal voice that hadn't been heard from, that was certainly the majority of the population, that their voice had not been addressed, and particularly women who hadn't been directly involved in the war. So you're providing undocumented information. Information is more about everyday life rather than dates and war and battles, political events, but augmenting those political events. So you are broadening the perspective of what is generally an elite history with something that is going to more fully preserve a certain cultural heritage. So awareness as well of what the cultural heritage is that you are contributing to. An oral history can also challenge versions of academic history, let's call it. So all of this was true, and yet, if you hear from the voices of people who are talking about it, so from an Italian perspective, fascism was this, the whoever wins the war, they get to write the history. Fascism was bad, it was wrong, it was, you know, and not that I was trying to establish that, no, and instead it was good, but people who were in it, again, didn't realize that they were in it when they were born in it, and lived through 20 years of their lives believing that that was the way. So, so you get a different perspective of that challenges accepted versions of history. When you're talking to older people, it's also very clearly a question of preserving and passing on that information over generations, where one of the reasons that I wrote my book was because I kept hearing about my grandmother this, my grandmother that on podcasts and books and programs, etc., and not enough people speaking to the grandmother, while there were plenty of these grandmothers of that age who were certainly still alive and lucid enough to give their own version. So passing on in the way that they remember it and that they want to pass it on. So I believe I gave Sheila a thing about the question of truth and truthfulness, and then fallacy, and why. Now, oral history projects have really kind of started in the 1940s, and then there was a Columbia University, I can't remember exactly what year that started at Columbia University, of giving academic value to oral history narratives. And because we are skeptical of absolute truth, given experiential filters, the way that even academic history can be skewed, the fallibility of the human mind and memory. So where is then the value of the oral history is the way that information, the way that information has been carried on, including what may have been forgotten, how it was remembered, how it's remembered individually and collectively, these sorts of things. Okay. So oral histories then establish connections and continuity with the past, which is something that we treasure and cherish as human beings, because these connections make us feel a sense of belonging and that there is something larger than ourselves. This broader sense of human existence, and that we are progressing, and that there is something to learn from the past and bringing it, and the way that informs who we are now and how we want to move forward, having looked at the past. It encourages us to consider, and I'm getting a little in the weeds here, it encourages us to consider what time is, what can be achieved in the span of a human life. So as well, the value of it is that this sort of history is also going to be easier for people to access with their level of interest. We're more attracted to hearing people speak than sitting and reading a textbook. So there, as well, there might be issues that from the past that need to be healed from a collective and personal point of view. In my book, because I was reconstructing a history of, I thought I was just going to be talking about food, and then it blossomed out into a perspective reconstruction of the fascist era through food, with exclusively with women. And there, as such, the histories that I did not include in my book were ones that didn't contribute to a type of person. I had various categories that were going to hopefully arrive at a mosaic that was going to create a fuller, broader history diachronically. So diachronically means that Ada is going to contribute then to Renata, and having looked at Renata and Ada, then Ida is, her perspective is going to take on a different light with each one, and so they feed back into each other. Certain kinds of histories that were very much about personal abuse, which then led women to move abroad and then come back. And so those were the kinds of things that I didn't include. If you're doing an oral history project of inclusion and exclusion, like I was, then deciding, you need to have criteria for deciding which kinds of stories don't create the mosaic. And that again is based on whatever your premise is. It's sometimes referred to as history from below, rather than the elite from the top, which is generally a broader base of people. So again, so the truth and the fallacy, what people remember, how they remember it, is also relevant, and if they remember it. You're not doing an oral history to fact check, but knowing what historical facts are, which you need to have well studied your period of time, so that you can recognize what is being forgotten and how things are being remembered in comparison to that. Considering that these are hindsight narratives and therefore mental constructions. There are, can I go on?
Yes.
Oh, okay, all right. There are three kind of aspects of this question of memory. So there's collective memory, and the memories that create group identity. We all went through this thing. We are a group. We all went through this in this way in the Northwest. and that creates our group. We all believed in this particular, et cetera, and delineations of that type. So the collective memory, the cultural memory of, again, as a collective of how the memory is carried on and creating, and how that creates a culture, which is relatively close to the group identity. And then dealing, and as far as traumatic memory goes, is the way a group is going about dealing with an event, a specific event, which then becomes, you know, part of your premise. Similar to this restorative history, where you're seeking to address a past injustice. In that as well, restorative history, you are giving back this history to people who have been overlooked, ignored, in any sort of manner, swept under the rug, not considered, not having not been taken into consideration, and that whatever point we are in our social awareness, we realize that we come to realize that that voice has been overlooked, and now we want to we need to go back into the past and pick that up. So you also, as an oral history gatherer, need to allow for and balance multiple perspectives. And it's sort of like the idea of equanimity. It's all got to be allowed to be there, particularly while you're actively gathering. And then in your analysis, you have to be clear about who you are, what you're looking for. Again, your premise, navigating all of their political sensitivities as well. So in a larger sense, not everyone can and should carry out oral history gathering. If you're not well versed enough in what you're discussing, so, or a recognition, if you're talking about, as I believe maybe that might be part of the idea here, of young women interviewing older women, how young, how prepared. Yeah.
After we talked with Paula Johnson the other day, Sarah and I decided it doesn't have to be younger women interviewing older women. It could be any of us.
Right.
That we all have something potentially to contribute to this story. And it could be an older woman interviewing a younger woman.
Yeah, I had thought when I'm 80, if I am fortunate enough to get there, in a way that's sound and lucid, I might like to interview young women in their 20s and just try to understand what that's about.
Yeah, wow. Um, so I want to circle back when you said not everyone should do oral history gathering. That
Yeah,
I think we need to hear your observations and lessons about that so that we don't step on our own tails. And you've made the mention that perhaps um a very valuable piece here is you have to know the historical context of
mm,
the person, the work they're doing, their life experience, so that when they're speaking, as you said, to know what's missing or what's unsaid or
right, right.
so what
It
other
does.
lessons about
I mean, one,
tell us why not to so we really know about that.
you need to be, you really need to be steeped in it, and have open-ended questions. Open-ended is so important. Um, but and yet you do have to provide guidance when a person stops speaking and you need to move on to the next thing. It can't just be the questions on your list. Uh, at a certain point in my interviewing, I just went with a basic outline in my head of the sorts of avenues I wanted to veer into, so that it would be open enough. It gosh, it's like your first couple of crepes, you're going to throw them away. Um, at least I have to throw them away. Till the pan is seasoned and you know where you're going. You may want to go back to those first couple of people that you interviewed once you understand what it's about. But if you're looking to get history, wow, I mean, history takes such a long time, a long period of time of assimilation to be able to make those connections and those broader pictures, so that you are actually doing an oral history project and not just asking people to talk about their lives. And that's the difference. As well, when people are talking about their past, you need to have a person who's going to be aware that there might be trauma in that past that may open up. And while the person is not there to as a psychologist sort of role, there is a healing that can happen as part of the overall purpose of an oral history project. And there needs to be capability and sensitivity there that comes with a vast awareness of again, a larger picture of whatever your premise is. So
So just in thinking about what we're embarking on, I'm thinking um, there's a whole category called gender studies. Maybe I should dig into that just for background to see what um, historians have come up with as far as women's roles in the 20th century. Um, just to have a frame of reference, um, but also you were talking about the things that we don't remember. Have you had the experience where you were able to ask a question that jogged a memory, that brought it back?
I think just the way the mind works, that is almost necessarily going to happen.
Mm,
Of once you open these doors, they open and unlock other things that you hadn't, the person who's being interviewed hadn't remembered or thought of. Just like telling any story about your past, and that, there's the whole free will perspective of, we have no free will with our mind. You put the question there, and the mind goes and does what it's going to do. There
mm.
is no planning and about that journey, which is why it's so um, it's so important that your premise be flexible, that you review it, and so doing research about women and gender studies, for example, I need to know that, but I can't bring it into anything like that into an interview with a woman who's had 4 years of education. Or kind of pull her around and get her to, say the things that I want to hear. I'll give you an example about Pellegrino Artusi and the way that that his cookbook, written in 1891 originally, and then the last edition of it came out in 1911. And it's just touted as the most important cookbook ever in Italian history, and he's the father of whatever, and et cetera, et cetera. And I really quickly discovered that none of these women who lived during that period, or directly after, when this most important cookbook was around, they had no idea who he was. I think 2 people out of my entire sample, because I also gave up asking, because it unmasked me as it, and made them feel kind of uncomfortable as well, because I was asking research questions. So you need to know, but your questions then need to be a different thing. Your
Mhm.
analysis then is yet again separate. So when you're seeing how a thing was carried on, it's because you've done your research. But not, put a harness on her and then taking her to the pasture where you want her to do her thing.
One thing I loved about your book was how uh, each of the women described their their home, particularly the kitchen. It sort of uh, provided the setting, and because things are not that way anymore, it was really vivid um, in how people lived.
Yeah.
Uh, I I don't know if that would be uh, something that we would want to include in our oral histories, whether it would be pertinent or not. But maybe, I mean,
Could be very
if
interesting, the discussing the kitchen. I think that in my own research, the way that the relationship with the kitchen and them getting architecturally smaller, in my research was dealing with women who were still cooking, doing hearth cooking. Gas was only sort of entering. Others who had a literal, had a fire underneath a stove situation that was set up, or a stew stove situation with a grating and coals in there with a a basket that held the coals from the hearth. And that had been going on, documented since at least the 1500s. And so the way that was all kind of carried through, but those are in particular the kinds of memories that older women, that in my experience remembered vividly, whereas they couldn't remember something from yesterday. But the way that the brain holds on to those memories when your brain was fresh and young is different from where are my keys kind of thing. There's also in their recollections of love as well. They were young and fresh, and so was love, and the way that they remembered meeting their beloved, and was also so delightful. But another thing about that is with your premise as well, that's your diamond, and there's also the rough around it that should not be discarded, because you've got the diamond, but you've got the story, which is the two of those things together. And that's going to give you something of value, because you're not just picking out the facts like the fruit off of a tree. You need the whole tree and the fruit. I got diamond, rough, and tree and fruit there. There you go. So keep the filter large mesh.
I like it. When I was first thinking about this project, I was thinking we could provide something for future historians, say, in my imagination, 300 years from now, so that they would have a sort of a window into women and their perceptions about a career in culinary in the 20th century, and what were the forces that caused them to choose one thing over another, and what were the forks in the road, what were the obstacles they had to overcome,
Women, right?
and what were the pieces of good luck that they ran into, things that shaped their lives, that could be a legacy, both now for our chapter, and then theoretically sometime in the future. We do have an archive where we can store these full oral history recordings.
Yeah, explain a little bit more about the archive, if you could.
Sure. Okay, a few years ago, I was the recording secretary of the chapter, and I inherited 14 boxes of documents, and they stayed in my guest bedroom for months. But I have a connection with the Southern Food and Beverage Museum, and they had a new research center that included an archive, and they accepted our what would you call them, artifacts, uh, as an archive for our chapter, and they would be willing to archive the documentation, the historical documents from other chapters, and even the umbrella organization, Les Dames d'Escoffier International. So, this would be a huge resource for future historians. Um, uh, and there's the life of the chapter, but as a group, we share our interest in food and fine beverages, hospitality, and those things. So we can look at it through that lens. How we live our lives, how the choices that we make, and the forces that pushed us one way or another.
So you were talking about a couple of different things here, one of which is looking at women in food and careers, what it took for women to develop a career, let's say as a chef, or to have a restaurant in our period of time, or if they're older, then how people who to a certain degree who have achieved a certain amount of success, or have accrued a significant amount of experience, and how that experience played out. But then the other discussion about kitchens is then personal and not about the career. So it's going to become really, really top heavy if there are just too many avenues that you're trying to pursue at the same time. If Les Dames sets up a thing of we want to talk to professional women in the restaurant business who have either retired or have accrued several decades of working in a restaurant. What was that like? How have things changed? How has it been for a woman, moving on through on that path? That's a different project than how have kitchens changed? Both valid, but then if you have another one of more about perspectives on food or sustainability or farming, then it's all over the place. Yeah. I lost your microphone.
Even though we do have hospitality as part of our tagline, food, fine beverages, and hospitality. We're more than hospitality. We have just about every profession that's related to food and fine beverages. So there's a lot of diversity. The common thing is the food and fine beverages.
Right. You might also want to look at the commonalities between, so if you want to go for an older population of, the top 5% age group, and then anyone who is qualified and capable of carrying out an interview, and see what their commonalities are, and then further reduce that group, so that it doesn't get too small. Otherwise, you don't have a collective. But what are the commonalities that, if age is an important factor, age and experience, what is it that binds these people, that you can then establish a premise of investigation?
Good. Good. Yeah, we'll have to do some investigating, and I can think immediately of several people that would be worthy candidates. But let's talk for a minute about rather straightforward interviews that could be done with anybody of any age, that you know, that would reflect their view of their role in the food and fine beverage world. And
Can I, right now, what you're saying sounds too broad. It's so
uh-huh.
broad. Yeah, it sounds like you're trying to be inclusive in a way that is going to lose direction, perspective, because it's just too big.
Uh-huh.
It's like what is your role in food is too large.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't have anything that you are looking to analyze and examine, so that you can create a portrait of a certain aspect of culinary history.
Uh-huh.
Okay, I'm sorry I interrupted you, but
Yeah, I love that analogy, a portrait of culinary history. And it could be in the present moment, you know, because it may be the present now, but it'll be the past tomorrow.
And awareness of where we are, how we got here, where we're going, always there. Otherwise, what's
Sarah,
yeah.
I'd love your thoughts about this. You're muted.
I'm listening keenly, and I have like a million questions in my head, so I took notes, but when I reviewed them, they're actually all too specific to really move this discussion forward. One, as you've discussed, like, you know, tighten it, come down with, you know, what is this you're really trying to get at? And I'm not saying this is what we're doing. It just occurs to me that to look at what the experience of the pandemic was in the United States on the culinary industry would be a common experience, and also quite devastating. Some of our members lost their jobs. They could no longer pay for their dues. You know, we had to have kind of, if you will, trying to even look at, do we need scholarships for our own members rather than to promote people coming into the industry for the first time. It was just devastating. And the restaurant business has changed probably forevermore. There are restaurants that will never pop back up. So is that just as an example? That's my question.
Can I take that as an example? All right.
Yeah.
So COVID had, the pandemic had a devastating effect on restaurants, in a very specific effect, that people tried to cobble things together to survive. Many didn't survive. why they didn't survive, etc. So who is your population then? Is it anyone in the restaurant business? Are you trying to create then? Are we going to create a picture from, I mean, I know you don't have people with hot dog stands, but probably not fast food. Let's just hypothetically, family style restaurants to high-end dining. I'm going to create a portrait, a mosaic of what that was like. And that's a way of limiting that perspective or creating a momentum within the pandemic that's not just what happened to you during the pandemic. But a few of these people, so I need to gather populations from, for me, it was north, south, small town, large town, islands, territories, etc. So I'm getting a mosaic of Italy.
Right.
And you're getting a mosaic of restaurants during the pandemic and ways of coping, success, and lack of success. And that, 100 years from now is going to be fascinating.
Yeah.
It's already interesting to us now. It's going to be really precious. The kind of information gathering, yeah.
Okay, that really helps. Thank you. Which actually, when you say the whole regional thing, that really kind of harks back to what Sheila's been hinting at, is that this is a project that really could be done by LADOM more broadly than just our one regional chapter. If we doubled down and did formal oral history.
Right, you would need to you could do it, demonstrate, and then have a model that the other DOMs could do, and then it could broadcast rather than y'all trying to do it at the same time, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's right. And
right, let's have a model, show it successfully, be able to talk about what worked and what didn't work.
Yeah. Well, and I think two things that you've said today already. One piece about if you have multiple interviewers that they need to circle back and kind of brief and debrief one another. And the similar training for interviewers. And then also the piece about how really as your mission, if you will, this like, what is it you're trying to do, could actually, it's a surprise party, right? You think you're doing this and suddenly it's like, boom, something else happens. Is that the first chapter, if it's us, right, we get this started and we find some things, the next group might actually have their own fascinating piece, so that they might actually, instead of, they're contributing as a whole, but they could really be telling a story for the region, but we can pass our questions down and say, this is what we're looking for, and feed them back up to us so that we have a thread that represents the north, the south, the big city, the small, but that they can also have their aha moments since they're doing the work. This would, as best we can tell, is completely volunteer.
Yeah, and also just so that they're not, peons in dogs' bodies, that they are given a certain amount of creativity within, rather than just being dictated to, okay, so now you're going to ask this and that.
And then it would also create the larger mosaic, as you were saying.
Right.
Is it time to talk about time, Karima? Do you have to go?
Yeah.
Oh, I think Sheila had a hard stop, but a closing analogy. I was saying to my husband, I just finished chapter 7 of my book, and I said to my husband this morning, it's like, I said it didn't do what I thought it was going to do. And he said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, it's like, I'm driving the car, but there's this passenger who's telling me where to go. And I think
Wow.
I know where we're headed. Um, but, but, I never know the roads, and that's the experience of writing, and the same thing with doing oral history.
Oh
Yeah.
my gosh,
Know where
that's
it's gonna go.
beautiful.
That's fantastic.
Thank you so much, Karima.
Yes.
Thank you for asking me to contribute.
Yeah.
We
will
are
be
so
on-
grateful. And Sheila will send you the recording so you have it for your own notes, of course.
Thank you. Thank you.
And actually, before you hang up, tell us in your own words what your waiver, if you will, how we could use this document so that we have a sense for how we might use it other than just for the two of us.
Oh, absolutely. This is, I mean, when I do presentations, I don't allow recordings and things like it because they're sort of a performance art. But this absolutely a broadcast, however, in whatever way that you want. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
so much.
And congratulations on chapter 7, wherever
Yeah.
you're going.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
it's the penultimate chapter of her book.
That's right. That's right. So
All right.
yeah, when
So-
I come back, I'm leaving for Italy on Wednesday. And when I come back, I'm gonna attack that last chapter, see where it takes me.
Perfect.
Send me chapter 7, please.
Oh no, it's in a draft form, so it's gonna be a while.
Oh.
'Cause,
Okay.
I just wanted to get it done so that I can move while I'm still in DC, move on through chapter 8, and then when I go back to Italy in October and November, I'm going to polish 7 and write 8, and then you'll see the end of it. So yeah.
All
Yeah.
right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks again. Bye
Bye.
for now.